Welcome to this session that will provide an overview of how the field of implementation science informs pyramid model implementation in Part C early intervention programs. This session is brought to you by the Parent, Infant, and Early Childhood, or PEAK team at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work's Innovations Institute. We have a few main objectives to accomplish during this video. The first is for you to become familiar with principles of implementation science that drive implementation of evidence-based practices. The second is for you to understand the application of these principles, specifically as they pertain to the pyramid model. And finally, we hope that by the end of this session, there will be greater clarity around how knowledge and application of implementation science principles can make on-the-ground implementation of the pyramid model easier and more effective. Let's start with what implementation science is. While there are several working definitions, we are going to use the scientific study of methods and strategies that facilitate the uptake of evidence-based practices and research into regular use by practitioners and policymakers. It probably feels familiar to you that we often have knowledge about what we are supposed to do in order to implement an EBP, but there can be a gap between what we know and what we are actually doing. And this is for a number of reasons. Mainly, we acknowledge that the research environment where a practice has been determined to be evidence-based in studies can be quite different from your local environment where you are trying to implement the practice. And so why are we spending some time talking about this? Well, we know that each program is unique and that you all have strengths and challenges when it comes to implementation of any new practice, including the pyramid model. And the reality is that no matter how effective the pyramid model is, or for that matter, reflective coaching, RBI, or any other EBP, if it is not implemented effectively, it won't be successful. And so our goal in spending some time talking about implementation science is to use the research that exists to help us think strategically about how each program is approaching implementation with the goal of leveraging individual program strengths and addressing barriers that exist in a proactive manner. Over the next several slides, I'm going to talk about different components of this active implementation formula, which is from the National Implementation Research Network, also known as NIRN. NIRN is out of UNC Chapel Hill, and they publish a number of great resources related to implementation of EBPs across human services, with a strong focus in early childhood. In addition, NIRN and the National Center for Pyramid Model Innovations, NCPMI, partnered together. So the pyramid model implementation guidance from the national pyramid model purveyors is in alignment with NIRN's resources. The active implementation formula demonstrates how we get to significant positive outcomes. In the context of SISIP work, the significant outcomes we are looking for are increases in children's social emotional development. So each piece of the formula is designed to help your program implement your EBPs more effectively. When these EBPs are implemented more effectively, you are more likely to see positive impacts on children's social emotional development. Furthermore, when the EBPs are implemented effectively, the workforce feels more connected to the work, and they feel more confident and competent in what they are doing. And these have a positive impact on what we know is a workforce that is stressed. There are 3 factors that support significant outcomes, and within these factors, additional frameworks that help further delineate the important components. The 3 factors are effective practices, effective implementation, and an enabling context. The idea is that if you have effective practices, effective implementation of these practices, and an enabling context, there will be significant outcomes. So I'm going to walk through each of these factors and their supporting implementation frameworks. The first factor is effective practices. And the framework that supports effective practices is having usable innovations. The usable innovation is the what. What is the EBP that is being implemented? A usable innovation is one that is teachable, learnable, doable, and can be assessed to produce positive outcomes. In SISIP work, the usable innovations are the pyramid model, Sheldon and Rush reflective coaching, and routines-based interviewing, or RBI. These EBPs have clear descriptions of their programs, clear essential functions that define the intervention, operational definitions of their essential functions, and evidence of effectiveness, including a fidelity assessment. Although each of these EBPs is a usable innovation, for this session, I'm going to focus on the pyramid model because that is the EBP our team supports. For the pyramid model, there's a fidelity assessment for individual providers called the Early Interventionist Pyramid Practices Fidelity Instrument, or EPFI, as well as a fidelity assessment that is used to assess program-wide implementation, which is called the Benchmarks of Quality, or BOQ. So as we look at the active implementation formula, the usable innovations, which comprise the effective practice section of the formula, is comprised of these three EBPs. The second part of the active implementation formula is effective implementation. Effective implementation contains two implementation frameworks: implementation stages and implementation drivers. While the effective practices, pyramid model, RBI, and reflective coaching, are the what in the active implementation equation, the implementation stages and drivers address the how of the equation. I'm going to talk about the stages first. The implementation stages delineate how the implementation work unfolds, and they offer a loose roadmap for implementation activities. The four implementation stages are exploration, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. In some implementation frameworks, you see sustainability as a fifth stage. However, for our conversation, we're going to consider sustainability as we think about the entire implementation process, as opposed to considering sustainability to be a separate stage. As you have probably experienced when you have implemented previous EBPs or other programs, it's critical to be thinking about sustainability from the beginning, rather than trying to sort out your sustainability plan once you have gotten to a place of consistent implementation. It is important to note that while it would be much cleaner if each stage of implementation neatly stopped and the next began, and if implementation always progressed in a linear fashion, the reality is that this is not the case. As you can see depicted in the visual, and as you've probably experienced, stages often overlap, and there can certainly be recycling of stages. For example, if there is substantial staff turnover, the program might move from initial implementation back to installation as new staff are being trained in the EBPs. Exploration is the first stage of implementation, and many of you are already moving through the exploration stage as you think about your pyramid model work. During this stage, a key activity is for a program to establish their program leadership team, or PLT. The PLT is responsible for keeping the implementation process moving forward, and so establishing this team is a crucial first step. Additional activities during exploration include becoming more familiar with what pyramid model implementation looks like in Part C and how it can support goals related to children's social emotional development, identifying what social emotional and/or behavioral data are currently collected in your program, completing the readiness checklist, and establishing staff buy-in. I'm going to talk briefly about the readiness checklist and staff buy-in. Establishing readiness to implement the pyramid model helps the leadership team ensure that there are both structural elements and, for lack of a better way of putting it, attitudinal elements in place that will facilitate implementation. Structural elements include things like adequate staffing or the ability to set aside time for pyramid model training and follow-up coaching. Attitudinal elements are more related to things like staff interest and staff willingness. Trying to implement the pyramid model when most, if not all, readiness factors are in place will help best set up a program for success as they begin implementation. The same is true for assessing staff buy-in, and this is also related to the attitudinal element. If the staff are not bought in to the ideas that attending to children's social emotional development is important, that it is within their role to talk with caregivers about social emotional development and behavior, and that participating in training and coaching is a valuable use of their time, it will be difficult to gain much traction with implementation. Therefore, it's important to take the time to get feedback from staff about their readiness to implement the pyramid model prior to proceeding with implementation. As an example of how to do this, having time set aside at a staff meeting to watch the first of the asynchronous videos we developed around what pyramid model implementation in Part C looks like, and then getting feedback from staff about their thoughts and interests in proceeding would be a good first step at assessing readiness. Moving from exploration, the next stage is installation. During this stage, the pyramid model is being installed within the program. At this time, the PLT completes the first BOQ, which again is the program-wide fidelity instrument. From the BOQ, the PLT develops a work plan based on the priorities, needs, and capacities of the program. Part of the BOQ is establishing a professional development plan for providers. While programs can decide where they would like to begin their work, we recommend that the PLT carefully consider the training and coaching plan early on. This ensures that infrastructure, such as having time set aside to participate in coaching, is established early, rather than trying to figure out how to incorporate coaching after the group has participated in training. And during this installation stage, at least some of the staff are trained in the pyramid model. Initial implementation is the next stage of implementation. At this time, the PLT has been established and continues to meet monthly to work on the action plan that was developed through looking at the results of the BOQ. And again, at least some of the staff is trained in the pyramid model. During initial implementation, providers are beginning to use pyramid model practices within their work, although it is not expected that providers would be at fidelity. Practice-based coaching, or PBC, is the coaching model used in pyramid model implementation. And during initial implementation, at least some providers are actively participating in regular PBC coaching cycles that are offered by our team. From a sustainability perspective, one goal to support sustaining pyramid model implementation will be having internal providers trained in PBC so they are able to provide coaching on an ongoing basis. While provider level coaching is taking place and practitioners are increasing their confidence and competence in using pyramid model practices during this stage, the PLT is also consistently gathering data and using that information to determine how implementation is going and what changes need to be made. We will talk more about the use of data later in this session when discussing implementation drivers and in our last video session that is specifically on using data to inform implementation of the pyramid model. Initial implementation is the stage that most programs live the longest in. This is the place where the PLT is meeting, at least some providers have been trained, and hopefully some providers are participating in coaching. Providers are using some of the pyramid model practices, but no one is practicing at fidelity yet, and there are still a number of program-wide fidelity indicators that have not been firmly established. The final stage of implementation is full implementation. This stage is similar in terms of activities as initial implementation. However, at this point, providers are practicing with fidelity And the program-wide BOQ is also showing that across the program, there's fidelity in pyramid model implementation. In addition, during full implementation, several sustainability factors have been installed. We deliberately did not specify which sustainability factors go in which previous phase because each program is going to be different. But the idea is that throughout the implementation process, the PLT has created a plan for sustaining all of the critical pyramid model activities. This includes training new staff in the pyramid model, having ongoing professional development, including ongoing coaching opportunities and training refreshers as needed for all staff in the model, phasing out external support or identifying ongoing funding to maintain that support, and ongoing data collection and analysis. At full implementation, at least one internal provider has been TOT'd in the pyramid model so that they can offer ongoing training for the program, and at least one internal coach has been identified so that there can be ongoing internal coaching to support pyramid model implementation. Now I'm going to move from talking about implementation stages to the second component of effective implementation, which is implementation drivers. While implementation stages delineate the general order of operations for how the implementation work unfolds, the implementation drivers are the components needed for effective implementation. Implementation drivers provide infrastructure that is necessary to support effective implementation of the pyramid model or any other EVP or practice your program is interested in implementing. The drivers are divided into two categories: competency drivers and organization drivers. On the bottom, you see leadership. In the context of this discussion, leadership is referring to using different types of leadership approaches depending on the challenge that the group is facing. I'll talk more about that part in a minute, but I'm going to start with the competency drivers. There are 4 competency drivers: selection, training, coaching, and fidelity assessment. Selection is the first driver, and it refers to being purposeful in recruitment or hiring of the providers who are going to be implementing the pyramid model. For most programs, the providers who will be implementing the pyramid model are not necessarily new hires, so we're going to talk about selection within the frame that this will be a change in practice for staff as opposed to hiring new staff to implement the pyramid model. Something we have found through our pyramid model work is that it is typically most effective to start with those people who are eager to engage. We often refer to these folks as pyramid model champions or early adopters. These are the providers who see the social emotional development as foundational for other developmental domains, who are flexible and willing to try new ways of practicing, and who are open to talking with caregivers about their concerns about their child's behavior. Having pyramid model champions within the program helps to increase momentum with other providers who, for whatever reason, are less interested or see less value in making changes to their practice. When the pyramid model champions are able to speak to the ways in which using the pyramid model has been helpful in their work, it is typically received more openly than when it is only administrators or the purveyors, like our team, who are singing praises of the model or practices. The next driver is training. For the pyramid model, we will have 4 asynchronous training videos, including the one you are viewing now, that provide some conceptual information about the model, as well as 6 synchronous pyramid model training sessions where the focus is on identifying the knowledge and skills providers will need to demonstrate in order to implement the pyramid model effectively. Coaching is the third driver, and it's closely related to training. We know that we have to start with training, but we also know that training alone does not result in a change in practice. You've probably gone to many trainings or seminars where you've left with great intention of making some change or using a new skill or tool, only to realize at some point after the fact that your practices haven't changed. This is totally normal. Change is really hard, and we are good at doing what we know. And so coaching helps solidify practice change by keeping the training at the top of providers' minds, helping providers work through obstacles to using the training that they've received, and generally providing accountability for trying something new. Initially, our team will provide coaching to providers, but again, as a reminder, as programs are thinking about their sustainability plans, it is important to eventually develop a plan for training at least one internal coach who can offer ongoing coaching for providers. Finally, fidelity refers to the degree to which providers are able to implement pyramid model practices as they are intended. Understanding fidelity is important because when we try to decipher change in child outcomes, for example, changes in social emotional skills on the costs, we have to know the extent to which the intervention has been delivered as intended. If the outcomes are not expected, but there is no data regarding fidelity, we are not able to know whether the outcomes are a result of the pyramid model, RBI, reflective coaching, not being the best fit to address cost outcome one, or if there was not an opportunity to see positive results because the pyramid model, RBI, and reflective coaching weren't delivered as intended. On the other hand, if we have fidelity data that shows the interventions were delivered as intended, the relationship between the interventions and the outcomes are clearer. And as a reminder, in the pyramid model, there's both a provider fidelity instrument, the EPFI, and a program-wide fidelity instrument, the BOQ. The second group of drivers are organization drivers. In contrast to the competency drivers, which are geared more towards the providers who are using pyramid model practices, organization drivers are systems level components. These include the Decision Support Data System, DSDS, Facilitative Administration, and Systems Intervention. The DSDS is a system for collecting and analyzing data related to pyramid model implementation that is helpful for both the provider and the program as a whole. An important function of the pyramid model PLT is developing a DSDS that is practical for the program and that provides meaningful information about both outcome data, for example, changes in social emotional skills in this case, and fidelity data, which we talked about previously. It can be overwhelming to think about creating a data system, but I encourage you not to overthink this piece or to make it more complicated than it needs to be. What we are looking for is for the PLT to establish simple systems for collecting provider fidelity data via the EPFI, program fidelity data via the BOQ, child outcome data via something like the ASQSE, the number of goals set and met around social, emotional, or behavioral concerns, or the costs, and regularly setting aside time at leadership team meetings to ensure the data are being collected and used in a meaningful way. A facilitative administration is the second organization driver. The primary function of a facilitative administration is to help create and maintain an environment where providers can practice in new ways. This often means changes in processes, policies, or structures. For example, we talked about the importance of coaching earlier when discussing competency drivers. For providers to be able to participate in coaching, there usually needs to be changes in policy to support a provider's ability to use some of their time as coaching time, as opposed to all of their time being set aside to see families. Alternatively, we've seen programs have success when they are able to pay their providers to participate in coaching and holding the coaching outside of providers' typical workday. In contrast to a facilitative administration, which is internal to a program, the third organization driver, the systems intervention, is more focused on external variables and policies that might impact your program's ability to implement the pyramid model effectively. For example, the SISIP-SIT team provides a structure to support programs as you are implementing your EBPs. Now we're back to the importance of leadership, where, as a reminder, the focus is on the leader being able to identify what kind of challenge the group is facing and selecting the appropriate strategies based on the challenge. There are two types of challenges we're thinking about: technical challenges and adaptive challenges. Technical challenges are those that are typically mutually agreed upon by the group. Members of the group view technical challenges similarly and see a similar path to resolution. On the other hand, adaptive challenges are those where stakeholders hold different or competing perspectives, either about what the problem is, what the path to resolution is, or both. So you can see that the strategies a leader would need to use in order to address these two types of problems would be different because they're different types of problems. Let's take, for example, the challenge of getting pyramid model coaching off the ground within your program. If everyone on the PLT and if providers in general agree that coaching is important and that providers need time allotted in their schedule to participate, then the leadership can pursue a solution that might involve reducing the number of family contact hours expected in a month by the providers being coached, using staff meeting time as coaching time, or some combination of both. Stakeholders would likely be able to easily come to an agreement that one of these solutions would meet the need. Tackling the logistics around making the solution happen might still be tricky, but when everyone is in agreement about what the problem is and some possible paths to solution, the problem solving can start from this agreed upon place. On the other hand, if the challenge is getting pyramid model coaching off the ground, but providers do not agree that coaching is important, the solutions to the problem are going to look different than in the previous scenario. If there is no agreement that coaching is important, finding ways to set aside time for coaching to happen is not necessarily going to solve the problem. So it's critically important that leadership is able to identify what type of challenge they are dealing with so that their response meets the need. Now we have talked about the implementation frameworks associated with the effective practices and effective implementation factors. So we're going to move to the final factor, which is an enabling context. The enabling context has two implementation frameworks: teams and improvement cycles. I'm going to spend slightly less time talking about each of these frameworks because we will also have an asynchronous video on pyramid model program leadership teams, which is the teams framework, and a video on data and evaluation, which will address the improvement cycles framework. In the active implementation formula, the what of the equation is the effective practices. Again, in the context of our SISIP work, the what are pyramid model, RBI, and reflective coaching. The how in our equation is the implementation stages and the implementation drivers. The implementation team is the who. This is the group that facilitates the work of implementation. In the context of the pyramid model, the Pyramid Program Leadership Team, the PLT, is the team that facilitates the work. We know that having an implementation team drastically improves the outcomes of implementing an EBP, so the critical step of forming your PLT cannot be overlooked. If you remember our discussion about implementation stages, one of the first things that was mentioned during the exploration stage was gathering the leadership team. If you have not already, you can learn more about who should be on the leadership team, the role of the PLT in implementation, and how the PLT functions to support pyramid model implementation in our video that is specifically about the pyramid model leadership team. That video about the PLT will also be available through the LMS platform through which you're currently viewing this video. Finally, the second framework in the enabling context factors is improvement cycles. Like the leadership team framework, we will talk more about improvement cycles in the final asynchronous video in this series that is dedicated to data and evaluation. However, to provide some overview, improvement cycles are used to gather data that can help PLTs identify and problem solve around barriers to pyramid model implementation. In this slide, there is an example of how to use the look, think, act approach to improvement cycles in the context of the BOQ, which again is the fidelity tool for program-wide efforts of pyramid model implementation. In this slide, you can see how the look, think, act approach to improvement cycles can function when thinking about coaching individual providers and their use of pyramid model practices. Whether you are looking at program level information or provider level information, the idea of improvement cycles is that the PLT is intentionally collecting data and using that data in a real-time way to make changes that will support effective pyramid model implementation. A member of our team is available to provide coaching and support to the PLT to help identify the best ways to approach improvement cycles within your system. In summary, our goal in this session was to provide an overview of how we can use principles of implementation science to support more effective implementation of the pyramid model specifically, as well as RBI and reflective coaching more generally. The first factor is effective practices, which includes the 3 EVPs of pyramid model, reflective coaching, and RBI. Effective implementation of the pyramid model uses implementation stages to think systematically about the order of operations for implementation activities, and implementation drivers encourage us to think about individual provider competencies that are needed, as well as organizational factors and leadership skills that facilitate implementation. Finally, there must be an enabling context that supports implementation. This requires a team that is focused on implementation, as well as a system for continuously checking in on how implementation is going so that changes can be made in a timely fashion. When we are able to put together effective practices, effective implementation of these practices, and an enabling context, we will see significant outcomes related to children's social and emotional development. This wraps up this session on using implementation science to inform implementation of the pyramid model in Part C, early intervention. I hope this session has given you a greater understanding of how we can use what we have learned from the field of implementation science to support more effective pyramid model implementation within your program. As always, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team if you have any questions or concerns. We can be reached at peak@uconn.edu. Thanks so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you soon.